Good morning, everybody. So I'm recording a video lecture this week on the topic of Reconstruction. And today we're going to talk about the real life consequences of Reconstruction for people living in the South. And the reason I'm concentrating on this is that understanding what happens in the South after the Civil War is really crucial, I think, to understanding a lot of what we're going to cover later on in the course. So the big question facing the nation in the aftermath of the Civil War was, how do we admit the Southern states back into the Union, and what is this new Southern society going to look like? And it's important to remember that Americans were largely in uncharted waters here. The Constitution made no provisions for what to do in this sort of situation, mainly because the Founding Fathers probably never envisioned that the Union would break apart. So there are a lot of competing notions about what to do, and we're going to talk about some of those competing notions today. But the big question that I want you to think about this week, and as I'm talking, and also sort of in our discussion forum, is the question of, was Reconstruction a failure? Why or why not? So first off, we have to talk about Reconstruction while the war is still going on. Government officials began thinking about what Reconstruction would look like before the war was over. In 1863, President Lincoln issued a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, which offered a full pardon to all Southerners who would take an oath of allegiance to the Union and acknowledge emancipation. This was known as the 10% plan because it provided that once 10% or more of the voting population of any state had taken this oath, they were authorized then to set up a loyal state government. By the following year, in 1864, Louisiana and Arkansas had done just that. Why did Lincoln want such a lenient Reconstruction policy? Well, he wanted to shorten the war. He, hoped to weaken the Southern cause by making it easier for Confederates to switch sides. And he hoped to further his emancipation policy by insisting that the new governments abolish slavery. Congress didn't like this plan, however. They actually refused to seat the representatives and senators that Louisiana and Arkansas elected under their new unionized governments. And Congress opposed Lincoln's plan for several reasons. One of the reasons was that there were some very radical members of Congress. They were known as the Radical Republicans, and they were very anti-slavery. And they wanted to make black rights, especially the right to vote, especially suffrage, a condition of readmission to the Union. Moderates in Congress, they weren't really interested in protecting the rights of the freedmen, but they did not trust white Southerners, and they didn't want the old ruling class in the South to return to power. Congress also believed that Lincoln was exceeding his presidential authority here. Lincoln was operating on the theory that since secession is technically illegal, the Confederate States had never actually left the Union, and therefore he argued that he could use his pardoning power to ensure that the voting population in these states were loyal, and then these state governments would be legitimate. Congress argued that, nope, Southern states, they had given up their place in the Union, and that only Congress had the power to decide how to readmit them. Congress then passes the Wade-Davis bill in 1864, and this required that 50% of loyal voters take a loyalty oath before the states could be readmitted. Once this had happened, then those who could prove that they hadn't willingly supported the Confederacy could then vote in an election for delegates to a constitutional convention. So this was a much more radical plan. It really made it a lot harder for the Southern states to enter back into the Union. The bill did not protect black suffrage, but it gave the federal courts the power to enforce emancipation. Lincoln used what is known as a pocket veto. Rather than vetoing the Wade Davis bill outright, he simply refused to sign it and he let the bill expire. So things were at an impasse. Neither Congress nor President Lincoln could agree on what to do, and then Lincoln was assassinated, and it was never really clear what sort of Reconstruction plan he wanted. All right, so while all of these battles are going on in Washington, what is life actually like for those who would be most affected by the end of the war and whatever Reconstruction policy was put in place? Southerners, both black and white. Now, we have to keep in mind here that the South is basically devastated. As you can see from these photographs, these are photographs taken of Richmond, Virginia, after the war. It really became a war of attrition, where the only way for one side to win was to completely ground the other side and its society into the ground. The Union Army had followed a scorched earth policy toward the end of the war. They had basically just gone through and destroyed everything in their path. So people in the South were destitute, they were hungry, they were demoralized. And slavery, the entire basis for Southern society, no longer existed. It had been abolished. But the big question in the South is, how would relations between the newly freed African Americans and white Southerners pan out? So what did different groups in the South want? Well, most white Southerners, they were not interested in granting full and equal rights to the freedmen. They wanted to keep the newly freed blacks inferior, with a status something similar to that of free blacks before the war, sort of a limbo between slavery and freedom. The newly freed slaves, they were seeking to be independent of their former masters, obviously, and many of them wanted to acquire land, they wanted to acquire education, they wanted the right to vote, they wanted all of the rights that were due to them as American citizens. There were also a lot of Northerners who came to the South after the war. They came there for humanitarian reasons. Some of them came for materialistic reasons. But many Northerners thought that they could reform the South with the help of the freedmen. They wanted to remake Southern society into something that matched the Northern society a little bit more closely. Now, following President Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson, his vice president, took over as president. Johnson was a Southerner. He was from Tennessee, and he had based his political career on representing non-slaveholding white Southerners. He was very much opposed to the wealthy planter elite. He was actually the only senator from a Confederate state who remained loyal to the Union, and he continued to serve in Washington during the war. And that was part of the reason why Lincoln had selected him as his vice president for his second term. He was, kind of a compromise, or he was kind of, sort of seen to be kind of, reaching across the aisle a little bit. But even though Johnson opposed the wealthy planter elite, he was not by any means against slavery. He only objected to slavery as it was a privilege of the wealthy minority. He actually argued that every white family should have a slave. So Johnson became Lincoln's running mate in 1864 because it was thought that having a pro-administration Democrat on the ticket and somebody who was a Southerner would strengthen the ticket. No one ever thought that Johnson would become president. Now, initially, some of the Republicans in Congress supported Johnson because they knew that he was an enemy of the planter class and that he would be likely to punish Southern traitors. But gradually, we see this very deep disagreement beginning to emerge between Johnson and the Republicans who are in control of Congress. So Johnson comes in and he proposes a plan. He says, we're going to place the Southern states under provisional governors, and these will be chosen from some of the few prominent Southern politicians who had opposed secession. These governors would then call constitutional conventions, and they would be tasked with ensuring that only loyal whites were permitted to vote in these elections. His plan required that Southerners take an oath of allegiance. It excluded any Confederate leaders or former office holders. They were excluded from holding power. Johnson also excluded anyone possessing property over $20,000 in value. So he's really trying to prevent those wealthy planters from participating in the Reconstruction process. The state constitutional conventions would declare the ordinances of secession illegal. They would repudiate all Confederate debt, and they would be required to ratify the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. And after all this was done, Johnson considered Reconstruction to be complete. So Johnson comes in, he implements this plan. And what happened? Well, what happened was that delegates in several states, they approved Johnson's recommendations. But they put a few qualifications in there. And all of the resulting constitutions that were passed under this Johnson's plan limited the right to vote to only whites. And state legislatures ended up passing what were known as the Black Codes, subjecting the former slaves to special regulations and restrictions on their freedom. And you're going to read from some of those Black Codes and analyze them for our discussion this week. So, obviously, this was not going to be, sort of very palatable to Congress. Johnson comes in, he approves the actions of the southern states, and he even begins to pardon some of the members of the old wealthy elite who come to him asking for leniency. Congress refuses to seat those Southern delegations, and they establish a joint committee to review Reconstruction policy and set further conditions for readmission. So now we have this showdown between the president and Congress over Reconstruction. Johnson, just like Lincoln had wanted, he wanted to use the power of the executive to grant pardons. He argued because secession was illegal, the southern states had never technically left the Union, and rather it was only individuals who had rebelled, and those individuals could then be pardoned. Congress, on the other hand, did not believe that the problem of Reconstruction could be solved by having former Confederates just admit, okay, sorry, I was guilty, I seceded, I'm very sorry about that, and, please give me forgiveness. They believed that unless the social and political system of the South was fundamentally altered, the old wealthy planter elite would just come back into power, and the struggle, all of the bloodshed and all the struggle for the Civil War would have been in vain. Congress argued that because it had the power to determine the legitimacy of its members, they could then declare the Southern elections invalid. And Congress also argued that they had the power to ensure that a so-called Republican, with a small r, meaning representative, form of government was put in place in every state. And they argued that the southern state governments were not Republican because slavery had given all the power to a very small minority. And so in order to fully reconstruct the South, they had to establish new conditions. And this meant not only for the abolition of slavery, but also giving freedmen the vote. Now, Congress definitely had the upper hand here. Johnson, he could pardon anybody he liked, but Congress had the power to refuse to seat them until Reconstruction was done to their liking. So the Republicans in Congress are insisting that blacks be given the right to vote, and they are very adamant about this. Why were they so adamant? Well, they had somewhat crass political motivations here. They expected that the freedmen, the African Americans, will all vote for Republicans. After all, Democrats had been in control of the South, and they were the ones who had maintained the system of slavery for so long. So it stood to reason that blacks probably wouldn't be, terribly keen to become Democrats, that they would repudiate the Democratic Party and become Republicans. So the Republicans would gain all this new political power. Most Republicans, it was only a very small number of very radical Republicans who believed in full racial equality. Indeed, most Americans couldn't fathom this idea at the time, but they did have an ideological commitment to the idea of equal rights in the abstract. And they were really afraid that the South would fall back under planter control unless blacks were given the vote. Congress passes 2 bills in early 1866, and they send them to Johnson for his signature. One of these bills extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was an organization that had been set up to help former slaves in providing them relief and education, legal aid, economic assistance. They were very active throughout the South in trying to help the freedmen. The second piece of legislation was a civil rights bill designed to eliminate the black codes. Johnson promptly vetoes both measures. And in doing so, he pushes a lot of the moderate Republicans who had been on the fence firmly over into the camp opposing his Reconstruction plan. Now, the veto of the Freedmen's Bureau stands. So the Freedmen's Bureau was abolished fairly quickly after the war. But the veto of the Civil Rights Act was actually overturned. And this is significant because this was actually the first time in U.S. history that this had happened, which tells you just how powerful Congress was at this point and how bitter this fight was. Congress then moves, so the Republicans overturned Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Act, and then they moved to pass the 14th Amendment, which is an incredibly important addition to the Constitution. This gives the federal government the responsibility for guaranteeing equal rights under the law to all Americans. And you guys are going to be doing your whole big project for this course on the 14th Amendment, so pay attention to this stuff. Johnson decided he was going to create a new political party called the National Union Party. And he decides he's going to run against the Republican congressmen in the 1866 election. He's going to try to unite the small number of Republicans who were still supportive of him with the reviving Democratic Party. And so the congressional elections in 1866 are essentially a referendum on the 14th Amendment. Johnson is not terribly successful at convincing most Americans, and the Republican majority in Congress is strengthened in 1866. So now Congress is firmly in control of Reconstruction policy, and so they begin to enact a series of plans in 1867 and 1868, and this is generally what's referred to as radical Reconstruction. So what did Congress's plan involve? So Congress's plan involved the South being put under military rule until black suffrage is fully secured. And they're kind of split on how long this period would last. The really extreme radicals in Congress wanted to have a very long period of military rule. The moderates and most Americans at this time wanted the military occupation to be relatively short. Eventually, the moderates won out, and any state who ratified a new constitution providing for black suffrage would then be readmitted to the Union, and they would be taken out from under military control. So the assumption here was that black suffrage was going to be sufficient to empower the freedmen to protect themselves. And it was, in some ways, a retreat from a truly radical position that a sustained federal presence was really needed to try to reform the South into a more egalitarian society. So even though it's called radical Reconstruction, it actually wasn't as radical as it could have been. So Johnson, as you might imagine, thoroughly opposes Congress's new policy, and he sets about doing everything that he can to obstruct the administration of radical Reconstruction. He dismisses officials who agreed with the plan. He countermands the orders of generals who were in charge of the southern military districts who were attempting to enforce this new legislation. He is doing everything he can to oppose this. Congress responds by passing legislation designed to limit the power of the president, including something called the Tenure of Office Act. And the Tenure of Office Act required Senate approval for removing cabinet officials and others whose appointments had been approved by the Senate. So they say, well, we have the power, the Senate has the power to approve these certain appointments to the cabinet and various other, positions. So the Senate should have the power to, if the president wants to get rid of that person, the Senate should have the power to, approve or disapprove of that removal. When Johnson tries to fire his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was the only radical Republican in his cabinet, Congress moves to impeach him. Does anybody know how the process of impeachment works? Well, the House brings charges against the president, and then he or she is tried by the Senate. And in this case, as would be in the case in the late 1990s with President Clinton, the Senate fails to convict Johnson. And of course, the vote here is much closer than it was with Bill Clinton. They were only actually one vote shy of the necessary 2/3 needed to remove Johnson from office. So in February of 1868, Congress impeaches Johnson for violating the Tenure of Office Act, but the Senate fails to convict him. 1868 was, of course, also a presidential election year, and the Republicans nominated the Union's most decorated and celebrated general, Ulysses S. Grant. Reconstruction becomes the central issue of the campaign. You have on the one side, Republicans are condemning Democrats as being traitors. Democrats are openly appealing to racism at this point. And Grant actually ends up winning the election by a very narrow margin. After the election, Congress then passes the 15th Amendment, which guarantees African American men the right to vote. So at this point, it's kind of instructive to look at this map here. This is a map of the former Confederate states, and you can see when they were readmitted to the Union. So this date here, you can see most of them were readmitted 1868, 1870, the late 1860s, early 1870s. Most of them came back into the Union. What's really instructive here is the date that's in parentheses on each of these things, because that shows the date of the election that produced Democratic control of the state legislature and the governorship. And what we see happening in the South after radical Reconstruction is put into place is a gradual reemergence of the Democratic Party and a reestablishment of white control over the southern state governments. So what we're gonna kind of shift to talking a little bit about, sort of how that process happens. So now the southern states have been readmitted. Now, at least in theory, African Americans had the right of citizens. They enjoyed equal protection under the law. Black men had the right to vote. And life is definitely changing for African Americans, for the freedmen, in other ways beyond simply gaining political rights. They are claiming rights, a variety of rights for themselves, and the freed slaves begin to try to establish their own institutions as well. One of the most basic rights that African Americans could now claim was the right to establish their own families. Under slavery, remember, blacks basically had no control over your own family life. If you were a slave, you had no legal right to marry. Even if you did marry in a religious or a symbolic ceremony, that bond had no legal standing. And your owner could sell off your husband or your wife whenever he or she felt like it. Furthermore, you had no control over your own children. They belonged to your owner, and he could make them do what he wanted. He could punish them as he saw fit. If it was she could even sell them off. So the right to establish a family was a really important and basic right. And African Americans embraced this really enthusiastically after the war. And you can see that in this example of a family record keeping sort of page. You can see before the war and since the war. And, this is a page where African Americans, where the newly freed slaves could actually keep a family record of, sort of births and marriages and deaths, just like, sort of people do all the time. So the right to accept, this is a very basic right. And through marriage, Blacks claimed citizenship. Legalized marriage was a way for the freedmen to take on the rights that accrued to independent heads of households, not just the political rights, but also the right to control the labor of their wives and their children. So this was especially, sort of good for Black men. Some ex-slaves also began to use the courts. Courts, of course, were an institution that had previously been closed to them to assert their rights against white people as well as other Blacks, suing for things like domestic violence, child support, assault, debt. You also see the freedmen beginning to form churches, fraternal and benevolent associations, political organizations, and schools. Education was a really big priority. And the schools that African Americans established after the Civil War were a really huge improvement on what had been before, when Blacks were basically denied all education. Most Blacks during this period viewed the idea of separate schooling as an opportunity rather than as a form of discrimination. However, these schools would eventually evolve into segregated public school systems once that gets established in the South. African Americans did all of this in the face of very vigorous efforts by whites to control their private lives and shape their new identities, as we will see when we read through the Black codes. Now, in addition to claiming the right to marry and the right to assemble publicly and the right to educate their children, the freedmen also began to organize politically. The most active political organization that mobilized the newly freed, the newly enfranchised African American population in the South was an organization known as the Union League. The League was actually an organization that had started in the North during the Civil War. It was kind of a patriotic club to support the Union and the Republican Party and the President Lincoln and the war effort. And like many political groups during this era, they were a secret organization that employed things like oaths and rituals to try to help develop a really strong membership base. After the war was over, the League begins to spread throughout the South. They start to organize loyal white Southerners and African Americans in some of the Southern cities. And when radical Reconstruction begins in 1867 and 1868, the League begins an effort to organize the newly enfranchised freedmen throughout the South, including in some of the rural areas. And so you had organizers who were paid, including advocates for the freedmen and anti-Confederates from Unionist clubs. They go to the South. They come from the South, from the North to the South to promote the League and to promote loyalty to the federal government in some of these ex-Confederate states. And this was really hard work. You have these organizers going out to where the mass of the freed people are residing, because most of the freedmen are still, maybe living on the plantations where they had lived before. They fell vulnerable to very swift and deadly retaliation at the hands of white landowners and vigilantes. Now, the Union League was about more than just organizing the freedmen in support of the Republican Party, however. They were also about educating the former slaves about their political duties as citizens. They were all about kind of promoting community development, self-defense, self-determination. They really tried to help the former slaves gain political legitimacy and embrace their new role as equal American citizens. So the Union League kind of takes over from where the Freedmen's Bureau had left off. It helped establish schools. It helped establish cooperative stores. It even started to organize paramilitary groups to defend the rights of the freedmen. Now, you might be asking, well, why would the freedmen need to organize themselves into paramilitary groups? Well, the South both before and after the Civil War, was a society that was, at least in part, infused with a very martial spirit and a military presence. It was a violent society because slavery required violence to survive. So this sort of idea that we have, and we're going to talk a little bit about how this idea kind of, sort of becomes perpetuated. This idea that we have of the South as this genteel, very, sort of high cultured society where you have, sort of gentlemen and ladies on the plantations. This is really, kind of a huge myth that masks a lot of the violence that was present in the South in order for slavery to kind of be perpetuated. And so this continues after the war, even after slavery is abolished, and African Americans had to organize and arm themselves if they wanted to exercise their newfound political rights. So the Republican Party takes over rule in the South, but it's a very unstable coalition that begins to develop. You have a lot of businessmen, many of whom are recent arrivals from the North, the so-called carpetbaggers. They come down from the North. They wanted to get government help for private enterprise. So you've got these northern businessmen coming down, trying to take advantage of the situation and, establish their businesses in the South. You have poor white farmers. They're kind of the second part of the Republican coalition in the South. They want to see their interests protected at the expense of the wealthy landowners, and they, sort of want to make sure that they're not going to, fall prey to creditors. They want to get themselves out of debt. The third element of the Republican coalition in the South are the newly enfranchised freedmen. And they are the vast majority of voting Republicans at this point. And they want, of course, education. They want civil rights. They want land ownership. So you have these three competing groups coming together under this one tent of the Republican Party in the South. And each of these groups has their own kind of distinct goals. They don't necessarily fully support the aims of the others. But nevertheless, in the very short time that Republicans were in power in the South, they did achieve some pretty notable things. They attempted to improve public education. They democratized state and local government. They expanded public services and responsibilities. They made a major effort to foster economic development and subsidize things like transportation and internal improvements. So they really were trying to kind of bring the South into the modern 19th century, world. And you can see this is a picture of some of the newly elected members of a Republican legislature in the South. And you can see that, there are quite a few white Southerners involved, but there are also a, significant contingent of African American representation there as well. In general, though, most of the Republican state legislatures in the South were pretty corrupt. And this was not unusual. This was part of a national pattern during an era in which private interests were really interested in kind of buying government favors. This was something that was expected. Politicians were expected to profit by taking bribes, by accepting contributions. And so the corruption of the Republican governments in the South, the Republican state legislatures, was not an unusual thing. It was not something that was out of the ordinary. However, even though whites controlled most of the southern state governments, African Americans were the ones who kind of received the blame for this construction. Critics of radical Reconstruction began to claim that giving African Americans the vote was disastrous because they were inherently unfit to govern, and therefore all the corruption had resulted from allowing African Americans into government. And you can see that in this cartoon here from Harper's Weekly, which is, sort of very, depicting African Americans in southern state legislatures in a very stereotypical and racist way. Even though 16 African Americans served in Congress between 1869 and 1880, they did not dominate state legislatures. The only place where they had a dominant presence in the state legislature was in South Carolina. All of the rest of them were majority white. And there were no black governors who were elected during Reconstruction. The most corrupt were white Southern lawmakers. Some of them were Northern carpetbaggers, but some were native Southerners, and they were also trying to, sort of profit off of things. So the African Americans in a lot of these state legislatures, they had to serve or support these corrupt and wasteful Republican regimes because the alternative, joining with the Democrats, was unthinkable. Democrats simply would not have them. And if the Democrats had got back into power, they would strip away what little political and civil rights blacks had won. And the small number of African Americans who were elected to state and national office during Reconstruction demonstrated, on the average, a lot more integrity and competence than the white Southern legislatures. So this idea that corruption resulted from including African Americans in Southern politics is simply a myth. But it was a very powerful myth, and it was one that was used to discredit the whole idea of Reconstruction. So we've got a lot of sweeping changes happening in the South. We've got changes on the social level, we've got changes on the political level, changes on the economic level. Despite all these changes, and most of them must have seemed very radical and devastating to white Southerners, especially those who had been in power before the war, Reconstruction does not break the spirit of whites who wanted to maintain the old system in the South. And they begin to try to shape a society much like one that had existed before the war. And one of the reasons that they were able to do this is because of the issue of land and labor. So probably the biggest question as the war comes to a close centers on the question of land and who is going to work the land. Slavery had been the backbone of the Southern economy. It had been an overwhelmingly agricultural region of the country. And now that it was gone, what type of labor system would take its place? Most people assumed that at least, for a while, the South was still going to have to be a predominantly agricultural society. And someone has to harvest the crops. So this brings us to kind of this interesting issue. After General Sherman, whom you can see here, captured the city of Savannah in Georgia, he goes and he meets with leaders of the local black community to ask them what they want to see happen now that the war is over. So the newly freed slaves, they come up with basically a list of what they want. Sherman asked them, okay, what do you guys want? And they wanted to determine their own economic relationships. They wanted to serve the national government in whatever way they could. Most of them were very loyal to the Union. Above all, though, they really wanted to stay on the land that their families had spent generations farming. And, this is kind of understandable, right? They were farmers. This is what they knew how to do. And they wanted to stay on the land. This was the land where their families had lived for years. And so after this meeting, Sherman issues an order, Special Field Order number 15, which sets aside portions of along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia for black families to settle. And these plots were divided into 40 acres of land each. And this is where the phrase 40 acres and a mule comes from. Now, this promise of 40 acres and a mule is not going to be realized for most African Americans because President Johnson ends up pardoning most of the white owners of the land. He orders that their land be returned to them, and proposals for any kind of broad system of land redistribution fail to make their way through Congress. So most blacks who had physical possession of these small farms never actually get the legal title to the land, and they end up being kicked off. So not only did the freedmen have to contend with efforts to bind them economically into a subordinate role, but they also have to fear for their lives. And the main threat that we see emerging to the Southern Republican regimes comes from the Ku Klux Klan and other secret societies that sprang up after the war that were really bent on restoring white supremacy by intimidating blacks who sought to exercise their political rights. The Klan was first organized in Tennessee in 1866, and it spreads pretty rapidly to other southern states, and they start to employ increasingly lawless and brutal tactics. It is basically a grassroots vigilante movement. At this point, and we're going to see how it evolves later on, but it's not really a centralized, organized organization. And because of that, it was very difficult to suppress it because it was secret, because it was decentralized. It was very ruthless, and it enjoyed enormous popular support among the white society. In the 1870s, Congress tries to suppress the Klan by passing a series of laws providing federal protection for black suffrage and authorizing the Army to use force against the Klan. Essentially, what we have here is the Klan is a terrorist organization operating within the southern states. These acts of Congress designed to kind of, combat this terrorism, they're known as the Force Acts or the Ku Klux Klan Acts. And they made interfering with voting rights a federal crime. And they also established provisions for federal government supervision of elections. And this is able to quell some of the violence and ensure that at least in 1872, there are kind of relatively peaceful elections happening. And so what we see in 1872 is that a large African-American turnout, this enables Republicans to hold on to power in most of the states of the South. The Democratic Party responds to the election in 1872 by changing their strategy and changing their ideology. They begin to appeal openly to white supremacy and to a traditional hostility to government, and this new strategy kind of dovetails with a resurgence of violence, which is designed to reduce Republican, especially black Republican voting. So we start to see this new surge of violence. Oh, hold on, let me get that out of there. This basically, now you have, sort of open, basically, rebellion going on. And the Northern public is increasingly disenchanted. They're becoming disenchanted with federal intervention. The Republican regimes, as we've talked about, were seen as widely corrupt. And so the president at the time, Grant, he tries to use force. He uses force for the last time in the South in 1874, when a paramilitary group in Louisiana known as the White League tries to overthrow a Republican government that was accused of stealing an election. But this is, sort of becoming increasingly unpopular. And by 1876, Republicans are only in control of 3 of the southern states, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. All of the rest have flipped back over to being controlled by Democrats and, by extension, the KKK. So this obviously was devastating for the freedmen, and you can see that in these depictions of these cartoons. And you can see the phrase near the top of the drawing at the left here, where it says, "This is a white man's government," right here. And this is actually a quotation from the 1868 Democratic Party platform. And according to these cartoons, I want you to think about, sort of what conditions or events are worse than slavery, and what view of Reconstruction policy do these cartoonists appear to be expressing. All right, so this kind of brings us to the election in 1876, the presidential election in 1876. The results of the election of 1876 which was between the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. The election was disputed. Tilden had clearly won the popular vote, but the returns from 3 states, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, the 3 southern states that were still controlled by Republicans, they were disputed, and it was unclear who was going to win the Electoral College vote. And the outcome of the election remained undecided for months. Congress then appoints a special commission to determine who had won these electoral votes. And initially, the commission was equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, but it falls under Republican control when one of the members resigns and a Republican is appointed to take his place. The commission gives the disputed vote to Hayes, but the result of that still has to be ratified by both houses of Congress, and Democrats in the House of Representatives are threatening to filibuster. So what happens is a secret backroom deal. In this deal, Republicans and Democratic leaders get together and they negotiate a compromise. They agreed that they would allow, the Southern Democrats agreed that they would allow Hayes to win the election on two conditions. They said, we want a guarantee of federal aid to the South, and we want removal of all remaining federal troops. Now, when Hayes takes office, he immediately complies with this, and he orders the Army not to resist a Democratic takeover of the remaining Republican state governments. So now the entire South is firmly under the control of white Democrats, and Southern blacks have essentially been abandoned. And so this really marks the end of the period that we know as Reconstruction. So what happens here? Why did the nation's political leaders agree to abandon Reconstruction? One historian has kind of put it very succinctly, and he says, what appeared to be taking shape was less a compromise than a shared political sensibility in Northern ruling circles that questioned the legitimacies of popular democracy. It now expressed itself as a weariness with the issues of Reconstruction, as skepticism about the capabilities of freed people, as concerns about the expansion of federal powers, as revulsion over political corruption, and especially as exasperation with the annual autumnal outbreaks in the Deep South, so the violence that happened continually in the Deep South, and the consequent use of federal troops to maintain Republican regimes there. Basically, the Northerners were just getting fed up with having to constantly deal with the violence, constantly, having to maintain those federal troops present there. And they simply said, we just don't want to do it anymore. It's not worth it to us. And so that basically is the kind of end of Reconstruction. So the reunion of the North and the South is accomplished, or the Reconstruction of the South is accomplished as the North basically acquiesces in Southern discrimination. And for this reason, Reconstruction is often considered to be a failure. But I want to know what you guys think. At least for me personally, I think we can look at all that they tried to accomplish during the period of Reconstruction and see it as really far-reaching and innovative. A lot of these policies were really kind of ahead of their time, and much of what the federal government tried to do in the Reconstruction is not going to be fully realized until decades later. So I think we can look at Reconstruction as a tragic failure, but I think we can also see it as an experiment that was ahead of its time. And so this is kind of, that's kind of my take on it. But I'm interested in knowing what you guys think. So I'll be interested in hearing your thoughts in the discussion forum this week. And I hope you have enjoyed my lecture here.